This is my true story. When I fell ill, I thought family would protect what I built, not trade it away like garbage. My son promised to take care of things while I recovered in the hospital. I trusted him. But when I returned home, my bedroom was empty. The bed where I rested, the chair I built with my hands, all sold, all gone. The betrayal hurt more than my illness. But I didn't shout. I waited. Because what my son didn't know was that the hospital papers he ignored held his biggest lesson yet. Before I tell you how, tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so these real stories of betrayal and justice can reach more hearts. He spent his life working for comfort, not for himself, but for the people he loved most. Every coin he earned went toward building a home that breathed warmth and safety. He worked days in the factory and nights fixing broken things around the house. Each nail hammered, each board polished, was done with care, not because the furniture was expensive, but because it carried meaning. That room, that bed, that small wooden cabinet, they were his memories carved into wood. It was never about luxury. It was about history, the story of a man who built from nothing and gave everything. The furniture in his bedroom wasn't just wood and nails. It was the timeline of his life. The bed where his wife had once slept beside him, the rocking chair where he had held his newborn son, the dresser filled with old letters and fading photographs. Each piece whispered memories of a love that once held his home together. When his wife passed, those things became sacred. He believed his son would guard them as treasures, as reminders of where they both came from. He couldn't imagine that those same things would one day be treated as junk to sell. He was never a rich man, but he was proud. Proud that his hands could create comfort from scarcity. Proud that he had raised a son who never went hungry, never slept on the floor, never wore torn shoes. He used to smile watching his son walk out of the house each morning in clean clothes, holding the lunch he had packed. It gave him purpose, the feeling that his sacrifices had meaning. He often told himself that every sore muscle, every sleepless night would one day be worth it when his son grew up and said, "You did enough, Father." But that day never came. He remembered when his son was a boy, running around that very room, hiding under the bed, playing with the dresser drawers. Back then, the laughter echoed through the walls like sunlight. The furniture wasn't just part of the house, it was part of their bond. It aged with them, scratches, dents, and all. The father kept it clean, polished, and intact through every storm. He thought one day, when he was gone, his son would keep it not as furniture, but as inheritance, the emotional kind, the kind you can't measure in money. Years went by, and the father aged faster than he expected. The house that once felt alive grew quieter. He noticed his son stopped looking at the old furniture with affection. He called it outdated, said it took up too much space. It hurt him hearing that. He wanted to remind him that those pieces had been witnesses to their entire life story, through sickness, through laughter, through loss. But he stayed silent. Because fathers often love in silence, believing that love will one day speak for itself. He never thought silence could be mistaken for weakness. He never thought the home he built, with his bare hands and tired bones, would one day be seen as disposable. Every time he looked around his room, he felt peace, a quiet kind that comes from knowing everything around you holds your story. He trusted his son to understand that. He trusted him to protect it. But trust, he would soon learn, is the most fragile thing a man can give. The sickness came without warning. One night, he felt pain in his chest, and by morning, he was in the hospital. The doctors said it was exhaustion and stress, years of pushing his body beyond its limits. As they rolled him into a quiet room with white walls and soft beeping machines, he wasn't afraid. He was calm. He believed his son would take care of things at home. The thought gave him peace. He closed his eyes and whispered a silent prayer of trust, never imagining that this trust would be broken before he even left the bed. The first few days in the hospital were heavy. The air smelled of medicine, and the nights stretched endlessly. Nurses came and went, checking his pulse, adjusting his IV drip, offering soft words. He missed home, the sound of the old clock in the hallway, the wooden creak of the floor, the comfort of his familiar bed. But more than anything, he missed feeling like a father, not a patient. He waited for his son to visit, hoping to see a familiar smile that would remind him everything was fine. His son did visit, at least at first. The visits were short, filled with polite words and quick glances at his phone. He often said he was handling things and taking care of the house. The father nodded, believing him. He didn't ask questions. He didn't want to be a burden. That was always his way. Quiet trust, quiet gratitude. He never imagined that the same son who once clung to his arm as a boy would now see him as an inconvenience to manage. Days turned into weeks. The father's strength began to return slowly, but the loneliness stayed. The nurses became his family. They talked to him, listened, even laughed with him sometimes. One nurse told him gently that his son hadn't called in several days. He tried to defend him, saying he must be busy, but deep inside, something began to ache. It wasn't just sickness now. It was fear. Fear that maybe the home he had built with love was no longer his. The doctors eventually said he could be discharged soon. They smiled when they told him his recovery was faster than expected. He felt proud, like a man who had survived more than illness, who had fought through pain to return to his family. He imagined walking into his room again, resting in his chair, touching the old cabinet where his memories still lived. He thought of sitting beside the window, watching the sunset like he always did. He had no idea that the sunset he was dreaming of had already been sold. When the nurse came in with his discharge papers, she asked him to sign a few extra forms. They were financial documents, she said, part of a special arrangement made by the hospital board. He didn't question it. His vision blurred slightly from medication, but he trusted the staff completely. They treated him with such care that it felt like family. They even called him Sir, with respect, not pity. He didn't know those signatures would later become the foundation of his quiet revenge. When he returned home from the hospital, the air felt strange, too quiet, too empty. He stepped through the door with his walking stick, expecting the smell of home, the comfort of familiar things. But something felt wrong. The walls were bare, the floor echoed under his shoes, and the house, his house, no longer looked like it belonged to him. The warmth that once lived in every corner had turned cold. He called out softly, but no one answered. Then he pushed open his bedroom door, and his heart sank like a stone. The room that once held his memories was gone. The bed where he had slept beside his late wife for decades was missing. The chair where he used to read every evening was gone. The old dresser filled with letters, pictures, and small treasures, empty. The curtains were pulled down, the carpet rolled away, the shelves stripped bare. The space looked lifeless, as if no one had ever lived there. The sight of it felt heavier than any pain he had endured in the hospital. He stood frozen in the middle of the room, his breath shaking. His son walked in casually, holding his phone, wearing an expression that wasn't guilt, but pride. He said he had cleaned up the house to make space for new things. He even mentioned that the old furniture wasn't worth anything anymore. Those words cut deeper than knives. The old man felt a lump in his throat, but no words came out. His legs trembled, and he sat down on the cold floor, staring at the marks where his furniture used to stand. His son didn't notice the pain in his eyes. He kept talking about how he sold the furniture to someone online, how easy it was, how much space it freed up. To him, it was just stuff. But to the father, it was the story of his life erased for profit. Every piece of furniture had held years of sweat, struggle, and love, and now all of it had vanished like dust in the wind. The betrayal didn't scream. It whispered quietly, leaving behind an ache that words could never describe. The father didn't shout. He didn't ask why. He only nodded slowly, pretending not to care. Inside, though, something broke, something deep and permanent. He felt small in his own home, a guest in the space he built with his bare hands. The walls he had painted himself now felt like strangers. The silence between father and son was heavy, too heavy to breathe in. He walked slowly to the corner, placed his hand on the empty space where his bed had once stood, and closed his eyes. For the first time, he wished he had stayed in the hospital a little longer. That night, he couldn't sleep. The house that once brought comfort now echoed with loneliness. He kept picturing the furniture being loaded into trucks, sold off to strangers who would never know their meaning. The thought made his chest tighten. He had trusted his son completely, trusted him to protect the house, to respect the memories inside it. But that trust had been sold for a handful of money. The man who had once called him father had turned into someone he no longer recognized. The next morning, he packed a small bag with just a few clothes and the papers the hospital had given him. He didn't say a word to his son. He walked out quietly, closing the door behind him. But his silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was strength, the kind that waits. Because inside that bag were not just hospital bills. They were documents, signatures, and proof. The kind that could change everything. He didn't know yet how his revenge would unfold, but he knew this. The boy who sold his father's memories was about to learn how heavy a single piece of paper could be. That night, silence filled the house like a storm that had already passed but left the air heavy. He sat in the corner of his empty room, the same spot where his bed used to stand, with only the sound of the clock ticking somewhere in the distance. The floor beneath him felt cold. The walls that once carried laughter now felt like stone. He sat still, hands trembling, eyes staring at nothing. His heart didn't ache from illness anymore. It ached from betrayal. He realized the body heals faster than trust ever can. He closed his eyes and thought of the years gone by. The times when he skipped meals to buy his son new clothes, the days when he worked under the scorching sun just to pay school fees, the nights he came home too tired to speak but still made sure his son had dinner. All of it flashed before him like an old film, one that no longer had a happy ending. He realized that what he had built wasn't a home anymore. It was a reminder that sometimes love can turn blind and sacrifice can turn to dust. He tried to understand when it all changed. Maybe it wasn't sudden. Maybe it happened slowly, in small ways, fewer conversations, shorter visits, less eye contact. It was like watching the light fade from a candle, one flicker at a time. He had mistaken distance for busyness, coldness for independence, and arrogance for confidence. But the truth was simple. His son had changed, and he hadn't noticed until it was too late. As the night went on, the old man leaned his head against the wall. He didn't cry, not because he wasn't hurt, but because his tears had already been spent on hope. He remembered how, as a boy, his son would climb into his lap after a nightmare. Now, that same boy had turned his father's life into one. The thought made his chest tighten. But behind that pain, something else began to grow. Calmness. Not the calm of peace, but the calm before a storm. He realized something powerful in that silence. Revenge doesn't always come from anger. Sometimes it comes from clarity. He had spent his entire life giving money, comfort, advice, patience. But now he had something else to give. Consequence. His son thought of him as weak, as someone who couldn't fight back. But strength, he knew, wasn't in loud words or heavy hands. It was in endurance, in patience, in the power to choose the right moment to act. And that moment was coming. He took the hospital documents out of his bag and laid them on the floor. His fingers traced the signatures he had placed weeks ago. At the time, they meant nothing to him, just part of the procedure. But now, he began to realize their importance. The hospital had asked him to review financial arrangements carefully, and something inside told him to pay attention. Maybe fate had guided him. Maybe karma had finally decided to lend him a hand. Whatever it was, he felt something shifting. The following days were quiet, almost too quiet. The old man moved around the house slowly, not because of weakness, but because every step reminded him of what was gone. He no longer looked at the empty walls with sadness. Now he looked at them with thought. Every bare space where a memory once lived became a reminder, not of loss, but of purpose. His son had taken his comfort, his peace, and his possessions. But what he didn't know was that his father still held something stronger, control over his own fate. Each morning, he sat by the window, sipping the tea he made himself. He had stopped waiting for his son's voice or footsteps. The house felt colder, but the silence was no longer cruel. It became a companion. He thought about the hospital again, about the way the nurses had treated him with such respect, the way they had asked him to read every line before signing. He remembered how they had said, "Take your time, sir." Now, those words echoed in his mind like a secret waiting to be understood. One evening, he took out the hospital papers again. Under the lamplight, he began reading them carefully. They weren't just medical forms. There were financial clauses, too, about payment arrangements and asset transfers. It mentioned something about a private trust. He felt his heartbeat slow as he read it line by line. The realization came like thunder in the quiet of the night. Those signatures weren't random. He had unknowingly secured his savings, his home, and his future under a clause that no one could touch, not even his son. He leaned back in his chair, letting the truth sink in. Fate had already set his revenge in motion long before he knew it. The documents had been drawn up by an advisor who worked with the hospital, a man who believed in helping senior citizens protect their rights. It turned out the old man's assets were placed in a living trust during his treatment, ensuring they could never be misused again. His son might have sold his furniture, but he couldn't sell what truly mattered anymore. The house, the land, the money, all were safe. That night, he slept peacefully for the first time in months, not because everything was fine, but because he finally understood what needed to be done. The plan was already written in ink, sealed with his name, and filed in legal hands. All he had to do now was wait, quietly, patiently, the same way he had lived his whole life. He didn't want to shout, didn't want to fight. He wanted justice to arrive the way truth always does, slowly but surely at the right time. He looked at his reflection in the mirror the next morning. The wrinkles on his face weren't signs of weakness anymore. They were proof of endurance. He realized that sometimes losing everything visible is how you find your real power. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. The paper he had signed in silence would speak louder than any argument. And soon, the son who called himself master of the house would learn that not all fathers break easily. Some bend, then rise again stronger. Days passed quietly, but the old man's heart began to feel lighter. The storm had passed, but something greater was about to begin. He no longer lived in confusion. He lived with purpose. Every moment in that empty room now felt like part of a lesson that life had prepared him to deliver. He had learned that revenge didn't have to be cruel or loud. It only needed to be clever. And in his case, it was already written in black ink, sitting safely inside the hospital's files. The trust clause wasn't an accident. During his hospital stay, the management had suggested a financial safety program for elderly patients. It protected their homes and savings from being sold or misused while they were in recovery. At first, he had thought of it as unnecessary, but something in his heart had told him to sign it anyway. Now, reading through it again, he realized how fate had guided his pen that day. It wasn't just a document, it was his shield. The clause stated that all personal assets, property, and funds would automatically transfer into a protected trust upon his admission. This meant the moment he stepped into the hospital, everything he owned was no longer under his son's control. The house, the bank accounts, even his pension deposits, all belonged to the trust, and he was the sole living trustee. His son had no idea. To him, the old man was weak and unaware. But behind that quiet face was a man who now owned the most powerful weapon, the law. He spent hours going through the fine print, and every line felt like a small victory. The document even included a clause that removed any relative proven to act in bad faith. The hospital staff had witnessed his son's lack of concern during his stay, the absence of visits, the delay in paying the initial bills. Their reports, combined with his quiet signatures, were now a legal wall between him and his son's greed. His son had unknowingly cut himself off from everything the moment he decided to sell that furniture. When he realized how strong his position was, he didn't smile with pride. He simply breathed deeper. There was no need to raise his voice anymore. time and truth were already doing the work for him. He wasn't angry anymore. He was steady, calm, and ready. Life had finally placed him in the position of control, not because of revenge, but because of justice. The man who was once treated like a burden was now the master of every outcome. He decided not to tell his son anything yet. Silence would be his greatest strategy. His son continued to act superior, unaware that the very roof over his head no longer belonged to him. Every time his son walked through that house, he was walking on borrowed ground. Every word of arrogance he spoke was spoken inside a home that was legally no longer his. The irony was poetic. The father didn't need to shout. The truth itself would humble his son soon enough. The day of truth came quietly, like every ordinary morning. The sun had just risen, and light spilled through the windows of the small hospital office. The old man sat in his wheelchair, dressed neatly, calm as always. He had already arranged everything with the staff. All he had to do now was wait. His son was coming to collect the final hospital bill, the same son who had sold his father's furniture while he was still fighting for his life. He didn't know that the paper he would hold that day would change everything. When the son arrived, he walked in with his usual air of pride, pretending to be the responsible man who had handled his father's affairs. The staff greeted him politely, but their tone held something different that he didn't notice. He went straight to the reception, demanding the bill, expecting reimbursement from his father as always. The old man watched from the corner of the room, silent, calm, unreadable. The truth was about to speak for him. The doctor entered with an envelope in hand. He placed it gently on the table and said the bill had already been settled. The son frowned, confused. "Settled?" he asked, not understanding. The doctor nodded and said, "Yes, fully paid by the account holder listed here." The son opened the envelope, expecting to see his father's name, but instead, there was another one. The hospital trust. Underneath it, the paper said clearly, "All medical expenses covered by the legal trust fund of Mr. Father's name. Beneficiaries subject to clause restrictions." The color drained from the son's face. He turned toward his father, who still sat quietly, eyes steady. There were no words, no anger, no noise, only truth written on paper. The realization hit like lightning. Everything, the property, the accounts, the savings, had been transferred out of his reach. His father had done what no argument could have done. He had taken back control without a single shout. The son's arrogance began to collapse piece by piece, replaced by disbelief. The doctor looked at the father with quiet respect and then back at the son. "Your father made sure his future and his peace were secure," he said softly. The son stood frozen, trying to process it all. Every plan he had built, every lie he had told himself about being in control, vanished in that one moment. The man he had treated as weak had turned out to be wiser and stronger than he ever imagined. The very furniture he sold out of greed had pushed his father toward the action that destroyed his own wealth. The father's lips curved slightly, not into a smile of victory, but into one of closure. He didn't need revenge anymore. He had truth. Justice had come in silence, and silence had done what shouting never could. He didn't say a word as his son stumbled backward, humiliated. The papers in his hand felt heavier than stone. The father looked at him one last time, not with hatred, but with quiet pity, the kind only a man of wisdom can feel for a fool who built his own downfall. The silence that followed that day was heavier than any thunderstorm. The son left the hospital without another word, his pride shattered like broken glass underfoot. For years, he had treated his father as an afterthought, someone to control, someone to command. But now, as he stepped into the sunlight outside, the world looked different. He wasn't the powerful man he thought he was. He was exposed, small, and empty. Everything he had built from greed had vanished overnight, and the people who once respected him now whispered his name with pity. Word spread quickly through the family. Relatives who had once believed the son's lies began to talk. They spoke about the father's strength, his calmness, and the way he had endured every insult without striking back. Neighbors whispered about how karma had finally arrived at his doorstep. The son tried to defend himself, but the story had already escaped his control. In the town, everyone began to see the truth for what it was. A father's quiet patience had defeated a son's pride. The father didn't celebrate, he didn't boast or gloat. He simply sat in his chair by the window, letting the wind brush against his face. For him, revenge wasn't about winning. It was about restoring balance. He didn't want to see his son destroyed. He just wanted the truth to speak louder than lies. And now it did. Every person who had doubted him now looked at him with respect. The man they once pitied had become a symbol of quiet strength and justice. Days later, the son came back to the house, hoping to plead, or maybe just to understand what had happened. But when he stepped inside, the locks had changed. His keys no longer worked. The documents that once tied his name to the property had been rewritten, sealed under the trust. He didn't own the home anymore. He didn't own the land, the accounts, or even the memory of the father's room he had emptied out. The man who thought he had control now stood outside his father's house like a stranger. The father watched him from the window, calm and silent. He didn't open the door, didn't shout, didn't move. He just watched the son walk away slowly, shoulders bent, arrogance dissolved. For the first time, the roles had reversed. The father was at peace, and the son was the one lost. It was poetic in its quietness, a kind of justice that didn't need noise or spectacle. The world outside saw the old man as frail, but inside, he stood stronger than ever before. He never spoke of it again. When people asked, he only smiled and said that time had its way of fixing what hearts could not. His peace came not from revenge, but from knowing that he had done what was right. His son had to face the mirror of his own actions, and that reflection was punishment enough. The father found healing not in hatred, but in the simple fact that dignity, once restored, shines brighter than pride ever could. After the chaos had passed and the dust settled, the old man decided it was time to leave. Not out of fear, not out of anger, but for peace. The house that once echoed with laughter now felt like a museum of memories, both sweet and bitter. Every corner reminded him of his sacrifices, of his patience, of the quiet strength he had carried for years. But it also reminded him of betrayal. And he knew peace could not grow in a place where pain still lived. So one morning, without announcing it to anyone, he began to pack. He didn't take much, just a few clothes, a few photographs, and the documents that mattered. Everything else he left behind. The walls could keep their memories. The rooms could keep their echoes. He had carried enough weight in his heart. Now it was time to let it go. With slow, careful steps, he walked out of the house he had built with his own hands, locking the door one final time. The key felt heavy, not because of metal, but because of meaning. It was the end of a story and the start of another. He moved to a quiet coastal town, far from the noise, far from judgment. The sea greeted him every morning with the sound of waves that felt like forgiveness. He bought a small apartment with the savings and trust funds that remained under his name. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was enough. The air was fresh, the mornings were peaceful, and for the first time in years, he could breathe freely. He was no longer someone's father, someone's burden, someone's afterthought. He was simply himself again. Every day, he took long walks by the water. Sometimes he would sit on a bench, watching the sky change colors, thinking about everything that had happened. There were no regrets. Every step, every choice, every moment of silence had led him here, to a life without noise, without lies, without disappointment. He didn't seek revenge anymore. He didn't need it. The world had already balanced the scales for him. His son had lost everything he once thought mattered, while he had gained what truly did: peace. People in the town came to know him as the quiet man by the sea. He helped where he could, shared stories when asked, and smiled often. No one knew the full weight of the life he had lived. He never spoke of betrayal or family. He only spoke of lessons, about patience, dignity, and truth. His silence carried more meaning than most people's words. Those who listened to him could feel the depth behind every calm sentence, the quiet wisdom born from heartbreak and healing. In the evenings, He would sit near the window, the sound of waves reaching into his home. The moonlight touched his face, soft and gentle. He would think of his past, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. He had loved deeply, he had been hurt deeply, and he had survived. That, to him, was victory enough. Revenge had never been about destruction. It was about reclaiming his dignity, and he had done that in full. He was no longer the old man left behind. He was the man who had outlasted betrayal. Now, as the old man sits in the quiet of his seaside home, the past feels like a faraway echo. The waves still come and go, just like memories, some gentle, some crashing, but all part of the same tide. He often thinks about his journey, not with sorrow, but with understanding. Life had taken everything from him, trust, love, even his home, and yet somehow it had given him something greater in return. It had given him wisdom, the kind that does not shout, does not rage, but simply knows when to let go. He doesn't miss the noise anymore. The voices, the arguments, the weight of trying to be understood, all of it has faded away with time. What remains is peace, the kind that comes when you stop chasing fairness and start accepting truth. His son's betrayal once felt like a knife in the heart, but now it feels like a necessary wound, one that taught him the value of self-respect. Pain had been his greatest teacher, and silence had been his only friend through it all. He sometimes smiles when he remembers the man he used to be, always giving, always hoping, always forgiving. That man was kind, but also blind. He had believed that blood was enough to guarantee loyalty. But life had proven otherwise. Family, he learned, is not about blood. It's about respect, care, and shared values. A father can raise a son, but he cannot force a heart to stay good. And when that heart turns cruel, the only thing left to do is to walk away with dignity. Each evening, as he watches the sun sink into the horizon, he feels a quiet gratitude, not for the betrayal, but for the clarity it brought. The truth had freed him. It had shown him that even when people forget your worth, life finds a way to remind them, not through revenge, but through consequence. His son lost everything he once thought made him powerful, while the old man gained something priceless: freedom from needing anyone's approval. Sometimes children of the neighbors visit him, calling him Grandpa. They listen to his stories, not of revenge, but of lessons. He tells them about patience, about never letting anger control your choices. He tells them that silence is not weakness, but a test of strength. They sit wide-eyed, listening, not realizing they are hearing the story of a man who rebuilt his soul from ashes. The old man never mentions names. He only says, "I once knew a man who forgot where he came from, and life reminded him." In the end, he has no bitterness left, only calm. The sea, the wind, and the endless sky have become his companions. He knows that someday, when his time comes, he will go without regret, because he lived his last years on his own terms, not as a victim, but as a man who stood tall after being broken. His legacy is not in wealth or inheritance, but in the quiet power of his story. And his final thought stays the same. He betrayed me for comfort, but I found peace without him. He called me weak, but silence made me strong.